I'll simply hand you over to the moderator for the next panel, from the Naval War College, Dr. Nikolas Gvosdev.
Thank you. Good morning to you all. I'm Nick Gvosdev. I'm a professor here in the National Security Decision-Making Department at the War College. It's my pleasure to be able to moderate this third panel entitled The Strategy of Influence. We heard yesterday and we heard in Dr. Slaughter's presentation this morning some good news, which is that for the foreseeable future, the United States is likely to remain the world's preeminent power. But we're also facing the reality that the ability of other states to begin to constrain, put roadblocks in front of the United States to raise the cost for the U.S. to act is also rising. Some states may choose to act against our interests, and others can choose to withhold aid and support to initiatives that we feel are vital to our own national security interests. It's interesting that while we were meeting here in Newport yesterday, we had the first day of the summit meeting in Yekaterinburg in Russia between the chief executives of Russia, China, India, and Brazil. And this sort of illustrates the points we heard yesterday, particularly in the first panel, which is these four states are not seeking to overthrow U.S. leadership, particularly in the realm of finance and the economy, but as their first statements were released, you heard things like, we want more clout, we want more influence in how decisions are made. So they're not overthrowing a U.S. order, but they would like to have more influence in how policy is made. They're trying to modify U.S. leadership as opposed to opposing it altogether. Which brings us to the subject of today's panel, a strategy of influence. This can occur, of course, at two levels. It can occur between governments, and again, from the presentation this morning, the traditional model, state-to-state influence, can also occur increasingly between peoples, bypassing governments and working directly at the popular level. Dan Byman yesterday had talked about, before we were worried about the 15 members of the Al Saud royal family and how they would direct the affairs of the monarchy of Saudi Arabia, but that increasingly we are just as concerned with the opinions and thoughts of 17 million residents and citizens of Saudi Arabia, what they choose to do, how they choose to act, and a strategy of influence can be directed, again, both at a state to get it to change its behavior, but also at how we may try to reach out directly to populations and get them to be more aligned with a U.S. view of the world. This, of course, is also factoring into our policy debates in the greater Middle East, in Eurasia, in Latin America, and parts of Asia, which is how much influence does the United States actually have? How much do we have to accept the reality of a status quo and say we must accommodate ourselves to it? And how much do we say we have the ability to change opinions, hearts and minds, behaviors of governments on the ground? And we have assembled, I think, an excellent panel today of scholar practitioners. All three of our panelists are no strangers to the halls of the academy, but they can move seamlessly from the classroom into the highest positions of the executive branch or serving as advisors to the legislatures and to commissions. And I think that they'll be able to illustrate and discuss many of these questions in greater detail. Let me, since you have an extensive biographies in the briefing books that were extended to you, I'll just simply refer you to that because otherwise I could spend 5 minutes on giving you a detailed biography of each. We're going to ask them to speak in the order in which they appear in the program, which means we'll start first with Michael Doran, who is now at the Wagner School of Public Policy at New York University. Sir?
Thanks very much. How long do I have? 3 hours?
If by 3 hours you mean 15 minutes, yes,
15
you
minutes.
have 3 hours.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll be brief. Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I don't know if I moved seamlessly back and forth between government and academia, but I did move back and forth. And it's wonderful to be back in academia because in academia you get to think your own thoughts. But it's really horrible to be back in academia because you have to think your own thoughts. So my brain has become a big echo chamber. And so it's been very nice to actually come and listen to other people who know things and think about them. The keynote address that Anne-Marie Slaughter just gave was absolutely fabulous from my point of view. It laid out exactly the picture of the world that I have in my head, and I'd like to hone in on the communications and influence consequences that I see as a result of the picture that she just painted. She pointed out we're going from hierarchical to a flat world, to a people-centric world, and to a world in which modern distributed communications is extremely important. The point that I want to emphasize is that we as a government are not set up to deal with this with regard to influence. I think that's probably obvious to everybody. I'd like to talk to you about some of the practical difficulties that I ran into when I served in government trying to do something about this issue. So first, I think I'll just describe for you a little bit, I think a little bit more detail with regard to the movement from the hierarchical world to the flat one. Then I'll describe to you the tremendous impediments that we have in government for dealing with that. And then to try to end on a positive note, I'll give you some possible ways ahead as I see them. First of all, with regard to the hierarchical and flat world, the people-centric world that we're now in, we are not set up as a government to do influence. In fact, in the Department of Defense, many of you are probably aware of this, the word influence, if you use it, it immediately raises hackles, people get nervous. It's a nasty, in some communities within the Department of Defense, it's an extremely nasty word and it's avoided at all costs. There are other people who want to advance it, but in general, it's a very, very controversial issue. The question, does the Department of Defense do influence? Very, very controversial issue. And in general, I think as a government, we got out of the influence business at the end of the Cold War. Or at least we let a lot of the apparatus of influence atrophy or just got rid of it completely, like the United States Information Agency. The stuff that remains, like say the bits of USIA that in late 1990s were packaged up and moved over to the State Department, the bits that remain are still very much focused on the parts of the influence enterprise that coincided with the mission during the Cold War. So what do I mean by that? If you look back at what we did during the Truman administration, and the Eisenhower administration, and there's now a fabulous book on the subject by Kenneth Osgood called Total Cold War. It's a fabulous book, and one of the things that I liked about it was it allowed me to say to people, when people, especially on the Hill, would say, you know, we don't do this, this is not consistent with our democracy, and so on, it's a great thing to hold up and say, you know, we used to do this. We had a system set up to do it. We had a president that empowered the system, and we could do all kinds of things that we can't do today because they become very, very controversial. So back when we had that, we were in a different kind of information environment. It was in that hierarchical world that we're moving out of. And in that hierarchical world, people absorbed information differently. I think that was a world of deference and a deferential world, and today we live in a referential world, by which I mean, I can see it in my own life. I get up every morning, and the first thing I do is I go read the blogs written by people who think just like I do, to get my sort of my marching orders about how I should believe about all the things that are going on. And that's the way most of humanity now is, I think, getting their information. They're getting it from people who think like them, from their particular network. It used to be, of course, much more hierarchical. And when we had only 3 major television networks, only 1 or 2 major newspapers, the statements from the podium were an incredibly effective way of getting the message of the United States out. So statements from the podium would be broadcast out, and we could assume that they would hit the desired target. Then, secondly, selling the United States was a strategic information activity, because we were in a global competition with the Soviet Union. It had a completely different kind of system of politics and economy, and showing the people of the East Bloc that we had better kitchens than they did, and that we were sweeter, nicer people than the Soviet leadership was a strategic message. branding America undermined our enemy with regard to the Soviet Union. And so we set up an apparatus, the United States Information Agency, which was designed largely to go out and brand the United States to the rest of the world as we engaged in this global competition for hearts and minds. In the new world we're in, the referential world, the world that is flatter, the world that is networked, and also the world that is more fragmented, branding America is no longer as strategically important as it used to be. It's still important. I don't want to say it's not important, but it doesn't have the strategic effect that it used to have, both because the message is not as strategically important as it used to be, and because people don't listen to it anymore. They don't listen to the statements of the podium like they used to, because like me, they get up and they read their favorite blog or the equivalent in the Swat Valley, if it's a non-technological method of getting information. What that means is, what's happening out there in the world is that there are contests for power and authority between foreign peoples that have nothing to do with the United States, the outcome of which, however, has a tremendous impact on the strategic interests of the United States. So what's going on in Iran today is a conflict between Iranians about power and authority in Iranian society. But this is the best thing that has happened for the United States with regard to possibly doing something about the Iranian nuclear program. Make no mistake about it, this is a blow. This is the most significant blow to the Islamic Republic since it was founded. And this is a contest going on between Iranians. I think you can extrapolate out across the globe and say that on a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, particularly in the CENTCOM AOR and with terrorism, we're really talking about influencing conflicts between foreigners over their own identity and their own future, and branding America doesn't really help us with that. If we go out and we show we're better, we're sweeter, we have better kitchens, that's not going to make one faction. That's not going to make people like the Taliban less or like the Taliban more. So what that means then is that we need to set up an influence apparatus that can work by, with, and through not just our allies and not just our partners, certainly them, but anybody whose interests coincide with ours. So, I mean, to put it another way, David Kilcullen has talked about this problem, and he said that with regard to the counterterrorism messaging, the best strategy that we should be following is one of disaggregation. That is to say, Osama bin Laden wants to present himself as the leader of the Islamic world against the West. So there's a framework there of the United States versus Muslims, and he wants in any particular local arena to push everybody together under his banner to the extent possible, and to delegitimate anybody that would want to break away. Well, in any one of those local arenas, like in Afghanistan or Pakistan or elsewhere, you've got all kinds of identities that you can work with. There's not just the Islamic identity, there's the tribal identity, there's ethnic identities, there's regional identities, and so forth. And the right policy combined with the right messaging strategy can bust the veneer of unity apart and thereby undermine Osama bin Laden. But that's a messaging about identities that have nothing to do with the United States. And so that takes us into an influence realm that makes people very, very uncomfortable. Extremely, in our government, extremely uncomfortable. Now, it just so happens that, and I'll switch now to the second subject, which is the difficulties of engaging in that kind of activity. There are a number of programs, most of which I can't really talk about here in any detail, but the Department of Defense, out of necessity, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, developed a number of very innovative programs that I think were quite effective with regard to influence communications and so forth. And I took it when I was DASD for support to public diplomacy. I saw it as my role to try to break some of those programs out and have them more widely recognized in the government and apply them in places where State Department had the authorities. So there are parts of the world, you could think about where they are, where they're very strategically significant to what we used to call the war on terror, that are not actually places where we have a hot war where the Department of Defense has the lead, where using some of these capabilities would be quite helpful. And so we need a partnership either with the agency or with the State Department that has the requisite authorities. It's extremely difficult to do this. Extremely difficult. And I'll just point out a few of the difficulties. But I could go on really for 3 hours, but these guys are mean, they won't let me do it. So I'll just give it to you in 5 minutes. One difficulty, nobody is in charge of the influence enterprise. It cuts across so many different bureaucratic lanes. Even within agencies, even within the State Department and within the Department of Defense, there are so many different bureaucratic equities involved. Even just on pure communications, where you want to use influence, the fights are enormous and they are unbelievably bitter. All of the controversies that you've heard out of the Department of Defense, Office of Strategic Influence, the Lincoln Group, and so on. These were very real mistakes, but they were also mistakes that were leaked out, amplified, distorted, and so forth, in order to kill programs that were underway against the background of really nasty, petty bureaucratic fights, on which I could now do a PhD. And that's just within the Department of Defense. Then if you get to a position where you want to have interagency coordination on these things, these are, of course, often they're things that we want to, they're not necessarily covert or clandestine, but we don't want U.S. fingerprints on them too clearly. So the minute you start to coordinate in the interagency and you don't have an obvious counterpart on the other side, who's in charge of influence in the Department of State? It's not a category. It's not a category over there. The Bush administration put the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in charge of this effort. I think that there's a lot of arguments, and I've argued for that model of having the Undersecretary of State in charge of that. But doing this kind of influence, working together with the Department of Defense to undermine enemies in a way that doesn't have obvious American fingerprints on it, it cuts across the DNA of the Office of the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, which, by the way, is a very weak undersecretary, on purpose, because it cuts across those are the old parts of USIA that are there in the State Department. It goes against their grain because they want to brand America, but it also goes against the grain of the State Department itself, because in the DNA of the State Department, the DNA of the State Department is we negotiate behind closed doors with authoritative representatives of other states. We don't go around messaging publics. It makes them very, very nervous. Very, very nervous. So just creating the trusted community of people between DOD and state who could work together on these issues and come to a consensus was extremely difficult. Now, as I say, I could go on and on about many of the other about these problems in great detail. I'll just stop there. I think I give you enough to get a sense of the difficulty of it. And I'll just say then which way forward. I have to go against the current thinking, which says that we need to move all of this over to state and take it away from DOD. And I have to go against it for practical reasons. Not because I don't think that in a perfect world, I don't think the Department of Defense should be playing the role that it is in this realm in a perfect world. But we don't live in that perfect world. And we have certain facts we have to live with. Number one, the Department of Defense has developed a lot of innovative programs that nobody else has. So they already reside there, there's experience, and there's a feeling in the Department of Defense that it needs to be done today. It's not something we can just ramp up, take 5 years, put this new USIA together. We have to do it today. It exists today. We have communities of people who have some expertise. So that's factor number one. Factor number two, resources. Like it or not, Department of Defense has resources to put against this problem, and nobody else does. Again, in a perfect world, we should have another organization. We should have the influence organization that has this mission. We don't have that. And looking realistically at the political debate in the country right now and at the budgetary restrictions, I don't see us building a whole new bureaucracy. Then I would add other reasons that just from my point of view, from a not so much practical, but just from a strategic perspective, DoD brings certain qualities to the table that other agencies don't. I would say, number one, a strategic worldview. DoD thinks automatically of information as a weapon. That is, information used to destroy enemies, to undermine enemies, to weaken them. Not to engage, not to make people like us, but to weaken our enemies. And that is, in the current environment, I think it is a perspective that needs to be at the table. Otherwise, without it, you don't have strategy, I think. So DoD knows how to plan. DoD thinks about undermining enemies. And then thirdly, DoD also thinks regionally. And as Anne-Marie Slaughter pointed out, a lot of the major problems that we have today now are no longer state-to-state bilateral problems. Terrorism being a good one. And any of these issues that are people, in the people-centric world, you need to think beyond the borders of the nation state. And the combatant command has a very strikingly effective and different perspective about these issues because it's thinking across regionally and across these borders. So because for all those reasons, I would say DoD is going to play a role. If we're going to do anything in this realm serious, it's going to be led by DoD. If not DoD out in the front, at least leading from the rear. The demand signal is coming from DoD and the capabilities are there. I'm not optimistic that the influence organization for the government is going to be put together anytime soon. The Obama administration is going to have to learn, just like the Bush administration did, that this is not just brand America. But it took the Bush administration 8 years, pretty much. I think we learned it just at the end. A community of people came together that saw this. The Obama administration, they'll have that to work on, but they've come in with a certain perspective that they're going to have to work out of as they come into contact with these problems in Pakistan and elsewhere. So in the meantime, then, DoD has to put its house in order, and that's already happening in certain respects. But if DoD creates the plug that can fit into the interagency socket, then it can not just send out a demand signal, but also generate processes that will give us, I think, in the long run, the organization that we need. We still are missing within the Department of Defense somebody who is at the head of the influence enterprise in the department. It's horribly fragmented. We say over and over again all the time that this is an information war, but we've never put anybody in charge of it. And the people who are doing the sharp end of the spear in the information fight are often, even in combatant commands, 2 or 3 rungs below the combatant commander. So their perspective isn't put before senior leaders like it needs to be. So we need not just the programs within DoD, but we also need a leadership. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Next, we go to Professor Thomas Fingar from Stanford University.
Thank you. Thank you all for giving us 2 days to devote to this subject. I'm very pleased to be back here in Newport. I'm going to take a cut into the problem from a different direction, and I think, as will become apparent, have a somewhat different approach than Michael laid out for you in his presentation. I'd like to frame this by suggesting that we think about influence in 2 ways, and they're interrelated. One is influence the future, shaping the future, shaping events. so that we are not simply reacting and letting things happen to us. The second is influencing other nations, other people, other groups. The two are related. And I would like to identify myself very strongly with Anne-Marie Slaughter's presentation, that we have tremendous opportunities to shape our own future, to shape a common future for the world by working with other nations, other peoples, other groups. My starting point for this is Global Trends 2025, a study that I directed. Your background readings suggest that I am the author. I will take responsibility but not credit for that product. In putting that together, we solicited the views of literally hundreds of foreign policy specialists, not just from the United States, but from dozens of countries on 6 continents. It is not a prediction of the future. It is an attempt to identify trends and where they're headed and what is driving those trends. And whether it is right or wrong in any of its details is much, much less important at this point than the fact that this is a distillation of what foreign policy elites around the world think is going to happen, are beginning to prepare for, to seek partners, to plan to coping strategies. So we have a ready-made list of issues, problems, challenges where other people are looking for leadership. And the United States can provide that leadership. In order to frame this further, I'd like you to put 3 images in your mind. Close your eyes if you wish, however, make it effective. The first is Uncle Sam standing on top of a hill, and the hill is quaking. That much as we might wish to continue with the arrangements, the predictable aspects that have brought us to the position of the most powerful nation in the history of the world is shaking. There are tectonic plates moving. The discussion yesterday and this morning made that clear. The second image, Uncle Sam's on the hill. Others are attempting to join us at the summit, and we're attempting to prevent them from joining us. The third image, Uncle Sam, top of the hill, reaching out to help others to join us at the top. In thinking about strategies of influence, for starters, it helps to know which vision we have in mind. Are we attempting to influence others in ways that build upon a shared future and elicit cooperation? Or are we attempting to put together strategies of influence that are constantly checking to make sure nobody else joins us at the apex of power and prosperity? I'm going to return to those images in a moment. Let me set the stage for some of the findings of Global Trends 2025. The first, and I will do this in almost bumper sticker fashion because earlier speakers have identified the points. The first is that the unipolar moment is over. That we remain the most powerful nation, but the triumphalist period after